Welcome to another episode of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, support the podcast. You can do that by becoming a subscriber over at the Apple subscriptions or Supercast to get the ad-free version of the audio podcast, or find me over at Substack and become a paid subscriber where you get access to the ad-free edition, as well as my weekly analysis, and we do occasional off-the-record Zoom calls with supporters only. Joining us for the very first time is Father Emmanuel Lemelson, an Orthodox priest, a fellow dissident, host of the Father Emmanuel Lemelson podcast, and author of the Against the World Substack. The links are in the description, lemelson.substack.com. He's known to many as the advisor to Mark Wahlberg on HBO's hit docuseries Wall Street. In 2015, during his first presidential campaign, Donald Trump sought out and received for the first time in his life the blessing of a priest. That priest was none other than Father Emmanuel. Shortly after, Father Emmanuel became the target of a decade-long federal hit job orchestrated by Pam Bondi's brother and Big Pharma power brokers who wanted him silenced for good. After a 10-year war, he was cleared of all charges. Now he's turned the tables, shifting from the hunted to the hunter, exposing the hidden architecture of the deep state to a global audience. Welcome to the podcast, Father Emmanuel.
Thank you so much, Hiroya. It's really a privilege to join you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Really looking forward to this talk.
Yeah, I was, how to say, you came across my radar just recently, and it's funny. I had a number of people say you got to have him on, and here you are. And then I was listening to some podcasts you've been appearing on, and a friend, shout out to Buck out there in Texas, who I met a few years ago. I saw you were on his podcast recently, and there you guys mentioned you're in Switzerland now.
Yeah, southern Switzerland. Yeah.
I think you're serving at a monastery there, is it? Or
yeah, I attend the holy services at a monastery. That's correct, in the Swiss Alps.
And we can spend an entire podcast just discussing your fascinating background. I'm just curious, your foray into podcasting, into the space, Substack, and social media. It's relatively recent, yeah.
That's right. It's really been less than 2 years as a podcast, and honestly, it was my wife's idea. I'm a married clergyman. Most of the Orthodox clergy are married, as distinct from the Catholic clergy. And my wife told me for a long time, said, you should really start a podcast. And honestly, I didn't follow podcasts at all. I didn't pay any attention to it, but she was totally right. And eventually I heeded her advice and we started. And so we do the podcast together. Our podcast is a little different. It's not the traditional format where you have a guest speaker that joins the show. We try to tell stories really that are instructive and didactic and teach. And it's grown over time. It's started to experience more success. And then recently, about 14 or 15 weeks ago, we started our Substack, and it's grown quite quickly. We're the ranked number 45 now on the leaderboard after about 14 or 15 weeks of publishing. So it's grown quite quickly. It's been wonderful. I mean, it's one of the upsides of technology. We talk a lot about the downsides of technology and social media, but this is one of the upsides, is that everyone can reach an audience if they have something to say. So glory be to God that a centralized legacy media no longer controls it, because it was pretty corrupt, most of them.
Yeah, and your style is unique of podcasting, which I find interesting. So I've been watching your stuff on various platforms.
The serpent isn't whispering in the shadows anymore. It's being disseminated through official combat readiness briefings across 40 different military units. We just struck Iran, and while the smoke is still rising, you have combat commanders telling their troops that this war is, quote, all part of God's divine plan. They're telling our young men, our sons, that a sitting president was, quote, anointed by Jesus to light a signal fire in Iran to cause Armageddon. Do you hear that? They aren't just briefing soldiers. They're catechizing them for a suicide pact. It is apostasy and patriotic drag. These commanders are, quote, euphoric. They're zeroing in on how bloody this battle must become to satisfy a 19th century heresy. This isn't national defense. It's a blood-soaked delusion. It is the bitter fruit of an eschatology that hungers for war because they believe it will speed the rapture. Do you not see the inversion?
And maybe sort of to get into it, you met Trump over a decade ago, and I just want to get your thoughts comparing Trump from then and now. Maybe I'm jumping the gun, but in many ways, it appears that the Trump administration is the New World Order administration. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, sure. I'll be happy to tell you the story. I think the Trump administration is really the political and financial aspect of the changes that we see going on in our world. I'm not sure that they're really the real power. There's a sort of shadow power behind that layer, in my opinion. But yeah, it was about 11 years ago almost. It was September of 2015, shortly after he announced his run for president. Nobody was really taking him seriously as a candidate. They thought, this guy's just like a washed up reality TV star. He's not a serious candidate. And as it turns out, he came to Keene, New Hampshire, where at the time I was serving in a parish called St. George, a Greek Orthodox church. A wonderful parish, beautiful people. And he asked me to give the invocation at his rally there. It was about 4,000 people at Keene High School. And I said to him, I said, look, I'm going to talk about Planned Parenthood, essentially, the sanctity of life, those issues which are, fundamentally, we cannot say as Christians that, we could be part of a political party like the Democrats if they supported, the murder of the unborn child in the womb. And he said, that's fine. And then I gave the invocation. And after I got off the stage, he just asked for a blessing. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but I guess he had never asked for a blessing before from a priest. And it's something that I was not even aware there were cameras there. But of course, Reuters and everyone else was there. There's a flood of cameras. I just wasn't really paying attention. But after I gave him this blessing, which was very short because I had to actually go. I had gotten a ride from another priest, a brother priest of mine, and it was quite late, and I lived in Massachusetts at the time. It was, almost 2 hours to get home. And as I was just turning to walk away, he actually grabbed me and he pulled me close to him. And I remember thinking at the time, that's very unusual because I had heard he was a germaphobe. He didn't really like human contact too much. And he was hugging me. And it was kind of an awkward moment because I was turning to leave, but he was trying to hug me. And I kind of never really forgot that. And I had this sense of complete and utter sincerity from him. As a priest, you're with people all the time. I'd like to think that priests understand people. And I just thought he was completely sincere in both his desire for a blessing, but also his gratitude for that. That maybe it was the first time in that campaign that he had thought that he needed the help of God, perhaps, through the hand of a priest. And then I went out into the hallway and I was surrounded by a crowd of people, and they were pushing up against me and kind of moving me down the hall. It was, when I say a crowd, I mean a total flood of people. And they were kind of like touching me and they're saying, Father, can you give me a blessing? And I was kind of overwhelmed by it. And then he kind of comes out of these dual doors from the auditorium to the hallway, and all these cameras and lights are on him. And this reporter says to him, do you think you're going to win the election? And he responded with, I know I'm going to win the election because I just received a blessing from a priest. So I think that is historically pretty important because at least at that time, he seemed to understand the idea that, God must be with us to achieve anything. And that that the state is underneath God, that hierarchy. In my mind, there's no question he understood that. And that was the last image in my mind as I'm getting pushed down the hallway. And I was going to leave anyways, but all these people are flooding around me and stopping me. And it was really surreal, to tell you the truth. I've told this story maybe only once or twice, but most people don't know the full story. And that was that. And I remember telling my friend, his name was Father Constantine, we got in the car, and I just said, he's going to be the next president. I had no doubt in my mind.
And if we fast forward, if we're talking politics and religion, Holy Wars, the song from Megadeth that comes to mind, or the album, what's going on now, we've got Hegseth praying while, in the background, tanks and bombs are moving, which to me, as a Christian, is a bit perturbing. But they recently, it's almost like a repeat of when George Bush 20 years ago said, God told me to invade Iraq. And now we're seeing the same thing where Hegseth and others are saying, this is God's war on Iran. And even yesterday, Netanyahu says he was talking about the Messiah is just around the corner. We're going to make it. How do you interpret these events?
Lord have mercy is my first reaction. The shortest of all prayers really that we hear in the gospel. In Greek, we say Kyrie eleison. There is no such thing as a holy war. In Orthodox Christianity, we don't accept that. The Catholics have a concept of a just war. Muslims have a concept of jihad. Of course, for the Jews, they have an idea that their Messiah is a political and military leader who's going to bring about peace on earth through military might and political might. But as Orthodox Christians, we don't accept that. War may be a necessary evil, but it's something that requires repentance. In terms of Doug Wilson, who's the sort of spiritual father, if you will, if you can call him that, of Hegseth, last June and July, we did a 3-part series on heresies on our podcast. They're worth watching. They're quite popular now because they were really ahead of their time by like 9 months. We did one on Christian Zionism, which focused on John Hagee, the sort of prolific and very visible Christian Zionist. We did one on Zionism, and then we did one on syncretism. And then we did a 4th one that focused on Doug Wilson and Hegseth. And basically the thesis was that, we asked the question, could heresy lead to World War III? And it appears that way now. So those episodes at a time when no one was talking about it, and we didn't get a lot of views at the time, but now they're getting a lot of views. I hope people take the time to watch those episodes because they sort of clarify some important issues. I don't think for a second you could say John Hagee or Doug Wilson are Christian in any sense of the word. These are charlatans, in my opinion. They're heretics, and they have a malformed faith. Maybe in their heart they mean well. I'll try to assume the best, but they're not humble men, and they're not men who are willing to submit to the teachings of the authority of the church, and they seek to bring about their vision of what heaven on earth should be, and it involves a lot of money. There's a significant money trail in each case, which in my mind undermines their credibility.
Yeah, and in my I'm a bit of I'm a non-denominational Christian. I do primarily of a
non-denominational is a denomination, though, just to be clear.
Right. Yeah, but I guess I can say an evangelical. I've attended mostly Baptist churches everywhere I've lived: Kazakhstan, Croatia, Mongolia, and Mexico.
Well,
now.
we got room for you in the Orthodox Church. We'll let you in.
I'm good, but I think, but I agree with you. I mean, this whole Christian Zionist thing, from a biblical reading, I ran through the Bible 3 times when I first came across it from cover to cover, and you kind of which set my foundational worldview, and I never like what these people that you're mentioning, to what they're talking about to me sounds alien because what's going to happen is going to happen, but I just don't want to. I mean, anyone can see what the state of Israel is doing. I mean, they're killing fellow Palestinian, Christians and non-Christians. That is irrelevant. That distinction.
Genocide. You can just call it what it is. Genocide.
Right. And so to support that, but to support the politics, the Christian worldview is not a political solution. Jesus. I always go back to Pontius Pilate and Jesus, and him saying, "I can snap my fingers," basically, and bring angels and overthrow the political Roman Empire. But that's not my mission, right? And all these people that you're mentioning, they're using politics. They're leaning towards theocracy. And so, what do you think is going to happen? There's all this.
They're businessmen, Hiroya. They're businessmen who seek worldly power. Christ did not seek worldly power. There's a profound difference between the Jewish conception of the Messiah and the Son of the living God, Christ, who's our Lord. They could never accept what he was. 2,000 years ago, they couldn't accept what he was. They preferred Barabbas to be spared. They had a bloodthirst then, the Sanhedrin, which is now reconstituted, being reconstituted. It's a nascent Sanhedrin. They couldn't accept a suffering servant. They couldn't accept God's love as self-sacrifice. They wanted the law, the Mosaic law, and they still do. And the Mosaic law was part of God's grace, which led us to his only begotten Son. But with this new covenant, the Mosaic law is expired. It's no longer necessary once we have faith in Christ. They still cannot accept that. So when you see a so-called faith or a so-called Christian who desires worldly power and dominion, that's the word they like Doug Wilson and Hagee and so forth, they're thirsty for blood. These are businessmen, they're politicians, they're rhetoricians. They have a thin veneer of, we can say, I don't want to call it theology, it's glossolalia is really what it's closer to, but it's a political movement and a business movement that uses certain words that they control, like Christian and so forth, and Judeo-Christian, to really manipulate the masses who don't know any better. They mean well, the evangelical faithful. I'm sure they mean well. They want to give their tithes and their charitable, but they have no real framework upon which to understand the sleight of hand of these charlatans. And it is a sleight of hand. They have, for example, the average person going to these mega churches, they'll hear these frequent scriptural allusions. And well, he's quoting scripture, that's important, with no concept of an asymmetrical hermeneutic, that you cannot put new wine in old wineskins, as it has been said, that there is a new covenant. People use the word Bible, for example, a Greek word, by the way, biblos, right? The book. But there's two parts to that book. There's an Old Testament and a New Testament. And it's remarkable that these Zionists and Christian Zionists, how heavily they lean on the Old Testament. You say, well, why don't you just come out and say it? You're Jewish, for crying out loud. You throw around the name of Christ, but so do Muslims. Although they actually at least hold him up as a prophet, a venerated prophet, the most important of the prophets. Of course, the Talmudic Jews could not say that at all. Jews don't say it, certainly not Talmudic Jews. So you watch these men in action, and you say, well, maybe they're just the sort of the American branch of Talmudic Judaism, and they've sort of figured out the jig that if you just use the word Christ strategically in between quoting Old Testament scripture and get people sort of riled up, it's like an old-fashioned revival, if you will. You can make a lot of money, have a lot of political clout, and of course, there's nothing new under the sun. St. John Chrysostom, the venerable saint, one of the early fathers of the church, wrote 6 treatises against the Judaizers, he called them. And we see that today. It's really, once you get people into that state of mind, you've essentially denied the divinity of Christ. There's nothing about calling for war and all this bloodshed that has anything to do with what Christ was saying.
And yeah, as you mentioned Sanhedrin, I was going to bring that up. And that's how I view both this Jewish political Zionist class and their equivalent, American Christian evangelical grouping, where they seem to be a modern version of that, old 2,000-year-old Sanhedrin. And as you said, basically it's this political, business, religious class. And most of my favorite Bible-thumping preachers, just throw some, I like Paul Washer and others, he's a fellow Croatian American, but they're not political. They're just talking about sin, hellfire, and repentance. They're not talking about any of these things that some of the people you've mentioned are talking about. That's not their concern. And so, there's all this talk about what's going on in Israel, Greater Israel. Yair Lapid, a week ago said, yes, they're saying it themselves. The Israeli politicians are saying, we want biblical boundaries. We're expanding into Syria. We've taken Gaza, Lebanon now.
Notably Christian lands, I'll add, Syria and Lebanon and so forth.
Yeah, and
where
so
we've seen the population of Christians decimated by over 75% in the last 100 and so years, 120 years or so.
Yeah, and I've gotten miffed recently. The Israeli ministers are attacking my Croatia. Not that I really care for the Croatian politicians. They're all virtually globalist and run out of Brussels. But we didn't want to bend the knee. They were telling us to end relations with Iran. And the Croatian president said, no, we're not going to do that. Like, who are you to dictate our policies? And so the Al-Aqsa stuff is going on. And this has been talked about for a long time. In the 1990s, there's a great documentary on the Shin Bet where this Shin Bet actually stopped Israeli extremists from blowing up Al-Aqsa. Then because they thought it would start World War III. But now it feels like if it happened tomorrow, I wouldn't be shocked. There's this talk about a third temple. So your thoughts on all of that, as well as if we are on the verge of a third world war, including with what's going on with Ukraine, Russia, and China?
Well, I think sadly we are on the verge of World War III, if we're not already into it. Maybe we can stave that off through prayer and repentance. I think we could, if we could all do that. But there's no question that they're on a timeline to reestablish the third temple. Whether it's training up a new Levitical priesthood, which is almost complete now, to the importation of these red heifers from Texas that are now of age for sacrifice, to the creation of some 60 vessels to be used in the temple. If I was forced to bet, I'd bet that Alaska Mosque won't be there much longer. And it will probably be blamed on an Iranian missile, would be my guess. Probably blamed on the Shias. Like you pointed out, Netanyahu's not making much effort to conceal his spiritual underpinnings. If we can call them spiritual, I hate to call them that. It's more demonic. The recreation of the temple is going to be a tomb to a dead god, and they're going to have a false Messiah sitting in that seat because the Messiah already came, but he was rejected, and they cannot accept that. And one of the key differentiators, Oroya, is that they want an earthly power. Remember that. They don't have a very developed sense of a life to come, and it's not really their priority either. Their priority is worldly power, political power. I'm sure you've heard this term, Pax Judaica, sort of the logical successor from Pax Britannica and Pax Americana. And that has a few components. This idea that, even as Netanyahu said himself, that they will be a global superpower. And the sort of usurpation of American power in its decline, and probably almost certainly architected by them and their influence in American politics over many decades to feed this sort of beast. And I would delineate between sort of mainstream Jews and the Zionists. The Zionists are the ones I'm really speaking about now. Here, I want to be clear that I have many Jewish friends, and we as Christians, we have to be an icon to them. If there's any hope of them coming to know the Christ, coming to know the Messiah, the Son of God, it should come from us. So we cannot unilaterally condemn the Jews. We have to be a light to them. But the dominant movement in Israel, from what I can tell, is not mainstream Judaism. It's the Zionists. And some of these ultra-Orthodox, I don't want to call them fringe groups, because they're not really fringe. They're really calling the shots, especially under the Trump administration. But what we see happening now, the sort of interplay between the shadow spiritual power of these ultra-Orthodox groups and the Trump administration vis-a-vis his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who, not by chance, we can't assume it was, a Christian conception of courtship and love between him and his daughter, Ivanka. That, to me, was strategic. They are known to befriend the children of political elites. So, Ivanka became an apostate. She stepped away from Christ. She denounced him. Kushner is part of one of the most radical ultra-Orthodox groups out there. And, Chabad. And I think that has become the dominant force. Then you have the sort of second-tier players like Hegseth, compromised, of course, by addiction as an individual, easily manipulated by a Christian Zionist, Christian nationalist like Wilson, thinking he's doing God's work, not having a clear mind. And that's how you get an absolute disaster on your hands, where innocent life is lost. And you have not only this tragic loss of innocent life, but you have Americans many Americans, not all of them, have lost their ability to feel the pain of the loss of innocent life, like these 160 girls in this girls' school. They're not collateral damage. Those are innocent children. There's innocent women their lives are being lost. It's, what What a tragedy that our hearts have become so hard in America. And we still hear the pounding of the drums of war from these sociopaths, let's call them, because they have a malformed faith. We as Orthodox, the word Orthodox itself means correct teaching. Orthodoxia in Greek, like orthodontics or orthopedics, means correct. Doxa means glory. If you don't get the teaching right, this is what you get. If you cannot return to the authoritative teachings of the church and the wisdom of the church, which I'll be honest, profoundly distorted by the Latin church, frankly. There's many, many people in the world who are Catholic, they're disenfranchised. They think the Latin church in Rome is the authoritative, traditional, hierarchical church. It's not. It's the Eastern Orthodox church, but they don't often have access to it. So the healthiest, fullest form of Christianity, orthodoxy, is simply unknown to Americans. And what do they have in its place? It's a veritable panoply of heresies. I often call it the kingdom of the cults, where we see the rise of Jehovah's Witnesses and Pentecostals and Mormons and Christian nationalists and Christian Zionists and evangelicals. And their teachings just get weirder and weirder and weirder and then destructive. And then there's this interplay with politics. And then all of a sudden you've got what you're calling a holy war, which was never, ever condoned by the church.
One of the questions which I think is not discussed enough and is important for me is, I was going to ask you earlier, how this is leading to the throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So I see in many ways, I've been calling this out for years in the alternative, the globalists are theosophists, occultists, right? We can all pretty much agree. You can, Alice Bailey, Lucis Trust, I've been to one of their meetings, the Lucifer Publishing Company. And they talk about how Lucifer is the Christ and he's here now, and they're applauding World Economic Forum, UN, and they're preparing to externalize the hierarchy of Satan and his minions for this world religion and world government. And at the same time, you're seeing increasingly over the years in the alternative media, Gnosticism breaking out, theosophy out and out, occultism, from people who say we're fighting the New World Order, when in fact they are part of it. And then this Christianity, this bastardized version of Christianity, I want to get your thought. It feels like what is going on with this fake Christianity that you outlined, I think that's going to turn increasingly the world opinion against true biblical Christianity. So people are going to say, look what these crazy Muslims and the Jews and Christians are doing. And then there probably will be a nuke dropped, or this war will become more atrocious, and people are going to lift their hands up on Christianity. Do you feel there's a danger with that?
Yeah, the devil's got a lot of tools in his kit. He's a professional. But as I said earlier, there's nothing new under the sun. The reemergence of Gnosticism is no different than the reemergence of the Judaizers that Chrysostom was declaiming against. The church in her wisdom would convene ecumenical councils in order to combat heresies. For example, the Nicene Creed, the first and most important of the creedal statements of the early church, which stated what the church actually believes, was a response in part to Gnosticism. And so, like I said, there's nothing new under the sun. And, the Gnostics at that time, they had this concept that the flesh was temporary, so you could do pretty much anything you wanted on this earth, because in the end, you would just be fine anyways. It was all very temporal. And you see as sort of the precursor to Gnosticism, in my opinion, was the intellectualization of Christianity, vis-a-vis first the Great Schism in 1054, which gave unilateral power to the bishop in Rome, and then later incorrect teachings under influential thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas, who brought sort of the mystery of the church and the movement of the heart, the stills heart, into the mind, where it became purely intellectual, and then it became an academic pursuit. And then you had the foundations for a reemergence of Gnosticism. So these things have a history, and oftentimes people don't understand the history because really nobody studies theology anymore. I mean, even though every university, and I often say this, I talk about it quite often, in Europe or in the United States, was centered around the church, as were the communities. In the post-Enlightenment era, and especially in the last 100 years or so, almost everyone went to the university to study what Plato would call techne, right? They were really after the pursuit of Sophia in the church, we kind of use Sophia as a synonym for God. They went to the university to learn a trade because it was associated with a certain dollar amount that they would earn in their professional career. The result is if you went to the theology department of almost any school today, maybe it's getting a little better, I don't know. But at least when I was a student, it was the smallest department in any university. And I attended a university with 5,000 people for undergraduate. There were 5 people in the theology department. When I entered the seminary, there were 4 seminarians that entered that year. So everyone was studying STEM because they thought they'd get a better paycheck. It's true, actually. I'm sure they got much better paychecks than I ever got. Actually, I never got a paycheck from the church. But what's the result? We have now a society where everyone is wondering about these theological issues, but they don't really understand it. And they have very strong opinions, but it's an area of life where it's really probably the only area of life where everyone gives an opinion and almost nobody has any clue what they're talking about. And it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And so they're looking, and like, where are the theologians and the clergy? They're the smallest segment of our society, especially those that are truly well educated and who aren't performers. So then you've got, again, these charlatans that come in, and they're very noisy. They have really far reach. You saw it in the 80s with the televangelists, and now we've got the internet version of the televangelists with Paula White and company, who make a lot of noise, and it seems kind of impressive. And people say, well, I have this spiritual yearning. I feel this connection with Christ, and I need to go somewhere. And they say, well, Greek Orthodox Church, like, well, I don't speak Greek. Or Russian Orthodox, what do you mean? I don't know about Russian. Like, so there's unfortunately these perceived barriers that keep them from a really truly authoritative and ancient church with an unadulterated teaching.
I've seen in some of your Substack, you've touched on things such as the no-hide laws. I recently had the Ben Nunes on to discuss that. And one of the things I'm most obsessed about is this move towards world government, because, in the book of Daniel, in Revelation, it's implicit. The whole world, there's no exception. I take exception with these people who say, BRICS, multipolarity, this, Russia, China are going to save us. But the Revelation says all rich or poor, big and small, will fall under the dominion for this short period of the end of history, under control of this it's implied, this totalitarian world state. And now we have, you've got the United Nations, they're talking about upgrading. There's the Board of Peace, which is a new iteration of world government. Xi Jinping just proposed the Global Governance Initiative. So he just proposed. So you've got Xi Jinping and Trump both proposing world government. What are your thoughts on where we're at with that? And no one knows. I don't want to ask you a prediction, but it just seems like it could be within our lifetime. It may not, but it could be. And so, just thoughts on the world government and where we are when it comes to the end of days.
Yeah, nobody knows the end of days. I don't. But this looks a lot like it checks a lot of the boxes, doesn't it? And we did a podcast on that as well about almost 2 years ago, we called it digital dystopia, where we said essentially the thesis was that people would no longer identify with certain cultural identities or geographic areas. Who would say, I'm Spanish, I live in Spain. Like that would just become an artifact of the past. And you see it now. If you went to Spain, you'd see all sorts of different people in Spain, and same thing in Switzerland where I live. You see all these different cultures. And what does it mean to be Swiss anymore? Nobody even knows. It's like a memory of an idea. And I think that was very much so intentional. Even people don't think about the rise of things like Airbnb as being part of this, but it actually is. There's a beautiful saying from the French poet de Balzac that I often quote, that behind every great fortune is a great crime. And if you look at the fortune behind Airbnb, it was really moving people and displacing them constantly. Like in Italy, I visit Italy often. If you go to Venice, Venice is, I don't even know what Venice is anymore. There's no more street vendors selling fruits. And, even 10 or 15 years ago, it was a beautiful and wonderful place. Tuscany, same thing. Now it's like some form of Disney World. And Airbnb has done that, believe it or not. It's really caused the stability of housing that people associate with a community to be bastardized, to use that word again. And so now you have these sort of digital nomads. They even call it digital nomad visas. All these European countries have digital nomad visas. Why? People no longer associate with a cultural identity. In my opinion, that has hit most hard white Christian Western societies and cultures. You can see it in the Olympics when you see the people entering the stadium It's really only the European and the Americans when they enter that you say, well, everyone's like from a different place. The Chinese walk in, they don't look that way. The African countries walk in, they don't look that way. So, this idea that we erase cultural identity and fidelity, maybe get people to even hate their own cultural identity, which is a Christian heritage, and then, they can be controlled more easily. And so that can be done through religion, through syncretism. And you see this with the idea of, and you hear people have been indoctrinated with that. Well, we all believe in one God. And, you just challenge them a little bit on that. And they just collapse. They never even think about it. They proclaim it so boldly. And so when you look at a one world government, and you already saw the sort of nascent or the rise of non-democracies, the perfect political system, but it does have safeguards. But when you see the European Union and you see this European Central Bank and you see all these other sort of para-governmental organizations that have great power, but don't involve democratically elected officials that sort of preclude the populace, the demos, the people, as we say in Greek, that was the precursor to what you're talking about. And I think that as technology rises, people begin to see themselves as belonging more to digital communities than actual real communities. And in that sense, what are they subject to? Then they're subject to the manipulations of algorithms. So I think that greater control over people, social control, and this idea of a control grid is very real. And at some point, the plutocracy, I remember telling this to a close friend of mine 20 years ago. We were in the car driving to New York. I was talking to a friend of mine, Father Robert Spitzer, is a Catholic priest. And I just said, at some point, the plutocracy have realized that they have more in common with each other than with the people they're supposed to be representing. And so the breakdown of a sense of identity, cultural identity, religious identity was many decades in the making. The secularization of the school system and society. You can go to Canada, they actively burn down churches or they turn them into apartment buildings. For all we know, they probably have bathrooms where the holy altar used to be. This is such an attack on Western civilization and Western Christian civilization. And the result is a lost people. They truly are like digital nomads. The name of those visas that they issue now in Portugal and Spain and Italy and everywhere else now, it's very fitting, in Greece even, because they're a lost people. They don't even know where they belong anymore. And Americans were particularly subject to that, in my opinion, because it was always a very mixed group of people. Very, it never had real cultural cohesion. Maybe it did much more so 70 or 80 years ago, but for a very long time, what does it even mean to be American anymore?
Yeah, and what you're describing, I mean, it's effectively Tower of Babel 2.0. And people can go back to the early 90s. There's an actual EU poster of a Tower of Babel. In fact, I think their headquarters or one of their buildings is the Tower of Babel. And so that tells you that this is spiritual implications. It's literally out of the Bible. They're telling you it's satanic. And this is why, I'm a citizen of the EU, which I call the Fourth Reich or the new European Soviet. I've ad nauseum repeated that it's the blueprint, the model for this technocratic supranational totalitarian.
There's a lot of darkness coming out of Switzerland as well. If you haven't seen it yet, just watch the opening of their new tunnel. I don't know if you've seen that online, but it is, if you want to see a demonic display, and I don't know how this darkness enters Switzerland. I mean, even with the WEF, as you mentioned, and Klaus Schwab and these lunatics and Noval Hariri, somehow Switzerland has become this sort of like center point between dark and light. And yet at the same time, you see this influx of like faithful Orthodox Christians into the country, even though they're technically not even legally recognized in Switzerland. And yet the Romanians, the Serbians, the Russians are bringing the sort of light of Christ to a country that has so much darkness, legalized euthanasia and so forth, and assisted dying, and really Satan worship. That's, when you watch this opening ceremony for their tunnel, it's probably one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen, actually, in terms of just an open display of Satanism. So you see that in Europe, the sickness, the spiritual sickness. And, I would also just add into some of this liberal ideologies about diversity. I mean, look, to a certain extent, diversity is a good thing. I myself, I'm half American, half Greek. I have different cultures. I lived in different parts of the world like you. But the conception that people have been indoctrinated with that diversity is constant intermarriage and mixing of communities. There's actually the opposite of diversity. Diversity is when you maintain the boundaries. Like my wife is Albanian, for example. I don't want her to be Greek American. I revere her Albanian identity and heritage, And she learned to speak Greek. I learned to speak Albanian. We're not trying to mix it up in that sense. But this idea that we're going to take black and white, and I don't mean skin color, I just mean like two different things, and mix them up to a shade of gray, and that is diversity, is an inversion of diversity, actually. It's the elimination of diversity. So, people have been sort of conditioned to believe, and again, that destroys identity, right? It doesn't actually make the culture or the society any stronger, and certainly not the family, in my opinion. So if people don't have a sense of piety for where they come from, their traditions, the authority of tradition, they're a little bit more vulnerable, in my opinion. And then if they lose those things, through no fault of their own, like, I can't control who my mother or father were, right? I mean, it was God's will that I came into this earth, and same thing with you. But that's where the role of the church is so incredibly important, because it teaches us that the teachings of the church are so important as a framework for life and for living. And then if you take that away, what do they have? Just complete susceptibility to these heresies that we began the talk with.
You mentioned earlier digital dystopia.
Yeah.
And again, there's the financial side of you as well. Your history in investing in finance. You also discuss it on Substack. And one of my biggest, again, fears is what one of my past guests, I always bring him up, Edwin Black, the Jewish American historian, famous for writing many books on IBM and the Holocaust and all that. This social credit system we were alluding to earlier, he calls it the algorithm ghetto. Apparently you told me you have been debanked. I have, in a very elementary way from PayPal, been banned by the Department of Homeland Security, which is, a form of political persecution. And they're building out all these biometric IDs, digital IDs. Just in the past weeks, they're saying now all operating systems, Linux, Windows, Mac, smartphone operating systems, Androids, are going to have natively built-in identity verification. Some jurisdictions are even now talking about your home ISPs. I was reading an article about that yesterday. They weren't built for that. Your ISP level, when they connect your house, they want identity verification there for the users. Here in Mexico, in 3 months, they shut off our mobile phones if we don't link our identities. I have not yet. And our biometric ID here in Mexico. If we don't do it soon, we won't be able to buy or sell. And this is happening in every single nation on planet. I had one of my paid subscribers yesterday. We were on a call, and this person is floating around the planet, getting a plan B, plan C in Latin America and elsewhere. And I told them, look, there's nowhere to run. And they went to this country and they saw all of these things coming, and they told me yesterday, you're right. It's, the same restrictions are coming in. So how bad do you think it's going to get, this trajectory of the this social credit system on the planet? Because I ultimately think that's going to be how the mark of the beast will be enforced. So if you don't if you don't subscribe to, if you don't reject Christ or whatever, and I've given examples. Some guests have disagreed, but I disagree. We had a recent example of a Florida pageant. She won the pageant, and they told her, you need to sign a document that says a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man. For me, that is a form of denying Christ, right?
Of course it is.
So just thoughts on this sort of where we're at with the digital dystopia.
Yeah, it's happening. I mean, we've had fingerprint recognition on Apple devices for quite a long time, Samsung devices as well, Face ID. Every time you open LinkedIn, it tells you to verify your identity through a third-party identity provider. Same thing on X. They want to copy your ID. Everything you're doing is being tracked. The Siri and these other voice assistants are almost always listening to you, even when it's turned off. Databases like Larry Ellison's Oracle are recording it all for the government. You've got complete whack jobs, like the founders of these AI companies and Palantir and so forth, these military contractors run by, if not run by kids, run by people who live in utter darkness, Peter Thiel and so forth. And it's grim, but you can't lose. As powerful as they may seem, they're not more powerful than Christ. They're not more powerful than God. It's that simple. If you find yourself succumbing to despair, go back to church, pray, participate in the life of the church, keep it in perspective. Yes, I was debanked just like you. I know what you went through. My children were debanked, believe it or not, because I criticized Big Pharma. I criticized this company called Ligand Pharmaceuticals. I said they were a fraud. And their licensee was Novartis, the Swiss pharmaceutical giant, like the fourth largest pharmaceutical company in the world. And they hired the brother of the Attorney General, Brad Bondi, is Pam Bondi's brother, to quote, this is a quote from an email that we got by accident that I needed to be, quote, silenced for good. And so he was a former counselor to the current chairman of the SEC, Paul Atkins. He was a former high-ranking official at the SEC himself, close friends with Hester Pierce and the other commissioners. And they fabricated a case against me to silence me, to destroy me economically. So yeah, one day I woke up, my children's Charles Schwab bank accounts were closed. They had like thousands of dollars in them. Like since they were kids, they were saving up. My JP Morgan checking account was closed. Can't open a bank account anywhere. I was in the middle of building a church in Vermont at the time. Very difficult to build a church, self-funded, when you can't even open a bank account. So yeah, that's really a taste of what's coming when you talk of the mark of the beast. Being cut off from buying and selling is precisely what the book of Apocalypse, the Apocalypse, I forgot the name in English, the book of Revelations. The book of Revelations, that's what it says. You know, there's a fascinating prophecy from a very holy elder in the Orthodox Christian, Elder Paisios. He was writing in the 1990s. You may have heard of him. But he basically has done a remarkable job of seeing in advance, seeing these events we see now. And on a broader scale, if you look at what Chabad is doing behind the scenes with Jared Kushner and Witkoff to create the Abraham Accords. Like at first you might think these things aren't actually related, but if you look at the Abraham Accords, it's the first time that this sort of compliance of the Arab states, the Emirates, without a accommodation for Palestine and the Palestinian people. And Trump, held this out. He trumpeted it, no pun intended, as sort of this milestone in peace. But what it really is the complete dehumanization of the Palestinian people. But more importantly, it opened the doors for the Emirati states to invest in the U.S. And we're talking very, very large sums of money, including in One World Financial, his bank, which now has a federal banking license. And so you see his interest in sort of Trump is the conduit for political power now. Kushner behind the scenes is following very faithfully his ultra-Orthodox, I don't want to call it theology. Let's just call it a movement for now, Chabad. And their desire to bring sort of the end, their idea of the end times is a perfect world of peace. It's not a conception beyond that, a life to live. It's very undeveloped, but this idea of a worldly king and political leader who's going to establish Israel, this sort of Pax Judaica, to displace Pax Americana. And if you merge that together with this, I think it was December 19th, this White House memo that they would move the 7 gigahertz wavelength specifically for implantable devices like Neuralinks. And you see, of course, this nut job, Elon Musk running around the White House all the time. These companies, whether it's Tesla or Neuralink, whatever, and Tesla's collecting all the data on you as well, filming you, you don't even know you're doing it. They're living off government largesse. They're not, Elon Musk didn't become the wealthiest man in the world because he's a genius. Geniuses actually can't run companies, believe it or not. Like, find me any true genius in history. They couldn't organize labor. He's just a compromised man who's integral. He's sort of like bolted on to the government. And so he gets all these taxpayer dollars to build Tesla and now to build Neuralink. So you've got, let's say, the ideological driver in Kushner and Chabad, the political conduit in Trump, and it leads to a Pax Judaica that will almost certainly be driven by greater technological control over the populace. And I don't think they bat an eye over the idea of almost like Darth Vader like implant in your head. They're already doing it. They're sociopaths in my mind. And I saw that in the Bondi family because I saw this family. Pam Bondi is just a relief valve. I say this all the time. The people you see in the front They're the ones you're designed to see, and they're there to block and tackle the ones they don't want you to see too much. Like Jared and Ivanka, it kind of disappeared for years, right? They didn't really want them to see. That wasn't by chance. They just need to stay out of sight long enough to get the Abraham Accords done, get the flow of capital from the Emiratis, make sure that Trump is back in office, that he established his One World Financial, and that he has this new stable coin that's going to become sort of that. When you meld that together with this White House memo on implantable devices and the 7 gigahertz frequency, now all of a sudden, wait, Israel isn't surrounded by enemies except Iran. That's the one stumbling block. All the others are sold out, completely sold out. So I'm looking at Pam. I'm like, wait, I know her jig. I know what she's doing with the Epstein files. Her brother almost certainly was intimately familiar with the Epstein files, but I saw how he worked to cover Ligand Pharmaceuticals and Novartis, just going back to earlier in our conversation. They were preying on the sick and the dying, my friend. People who had a curable disease, hepatitis C. Hepatitis C was cured at the end of 2013 by Gilead Sciences. They had a revolutionary drug called Sovaldi. It was a revolutionary antiviral. But Ligand had this old molecule called Promacta, and they wanted it to be $1 billion drug, and so did Novartis. And so they set out to prey on the sick and the dying, and they turned into a $2 billion a year drug for people who had a fully curable disease. They gave us a presentation by accident. I call him sloppy Brad Bondi because he's not smart. He's kind of like Elon Musk. He didn't get to where he's at. This guy makes millions and millions of dollars a year, probably tens of millions. Brad Bondi, the brother of Pam Bondi. He got there by compromising his soul. When we were in this deposition in December 2018, I'm sitting across this table from all his SEC attorneys because to his credit, he had successfully weaponized them. I don't know if that's a credit. It's all his buddies. He had weaponized it against me. Like, we're going to roll this, dumb Orthodox priest, right? Because I took $500 million off their market cap by exposing their fraud. Ligand Pharmaceuticals, huge fraud. Later, the company collapsed, lost $4 billion in market cap, bondholder lawsuits, a dozen class action lawsuits. Everything I wrote came true. It was incredible. I made over 900 allegations of business accounting and securities fraud. So anyways, I'm sitting across this table in San Diego, and this clown, Brad Bondi, hands me this presentation. And it's called Project Goldmine. And I look in it, and it's a clandestine meeting between Ligand and Novartis talking about how they're going to sell Promacta to dying patients by increasing the number of sales reps and increasing the commissions to the sales reps to get them to sell Promacta and push Promacta to people who had a completely curable disease. Hepatitis C, when you get a cirrhotic liver from hepatitis C, even if you didn't get Sovaldi right away, as long as you get it, the liver fully regenerates. It's the only organ in the body that fully regenerates. So he realizes a few minutes later, he gave me the wrong thing. He goes, I need that back. So I said, yeah, sure. I'm just going to go to the bathroom for a second. I had my 3-ring binder. So I told my attorney, I'm going to go to the bathroom. So I went in the other room and I photographed the whole thing. I still have it. Project Goldmine. We actually talk about it on some of our Substacks, if you're inclined to read our Substack. In other words, these SOBs, I was going to the hospital to pray for people, to bring them the precious body and blood of Christ. They were going to the hospital to make money and get every last penny out of the sick and the dying. And then as I looked at the other documents that he was handing out to us, the ones that were not accidentally given to us, they were all redacted with all these black marks, and emails would go missing incredibly. Like the most important emails would just be, we couldn't find it. It's amazing. Because an email, there's always 2 of them, right? The sender and the receiver. Like you could lose 1, but how could you lose 2? So when I saw the Epstein files, my friend, I said, whoa, that playbook looks so familiar to me. Slow it down, make it administratively cumbersome, redact everything. And I got to tell you, if I were a betting man, I would bet every penny I have that Pam Bondi and her brother, Brad Bondi, were playing and running a protection racket for their clients. Because every client he had, especially after she was sworn in, got a president, like 7 clients, high profile guys, all got presidential pardons. And this was a totally incompetent lawyer, Brad Bondi. Pam Bondi's incompetent as well. These are not, it's not Mensa material. They're not geniuses. They're just compromised. So what I'm trying to tell you is that I understood at that point the darkness in DC. And when I was looking at this guy, Brad, I was looking at his eyes, and I'm telling you, my friend, his eyes were black. They were not brown, they were black. And he had this look, like a demonic look. When I looked at him, like, I got Project Goldmine, like, like we got you. And I'll just never forget this look. It's just totally demonic. And then later on, he did some very extraordinary things I haven't talked about yet. Really, really dark stuff. I'm going to talk about it one day if I'm still alive, if they haven't successfully silenced me for good. And they mean that when they say it, because a neighbor of mine in Vermont, where I also lived part of the time, this guy named Gregory Davis, was a whistleblower on another pharmaceutical company in the neighborhood of Ligand in San Diego. And he did wind up dead. He was married and had children. You can look up the story online. And interestingly enough, very often these pharmaceutical companies are run by guys who are like in their 50s. They're finance guys. They're not doctors. They're not into research. They come from the investment banking world. And for what it's worth, they're very often homosexuals. They're angry homosexual men. John Higgins, the CEO of that Ligand, was a very angry homosexual man. And this IR rep who had bore false witness against me and also completely gay. The entire SEC, when I went through that process, none of them are married. All lesbians and homosexuals. It's just become like this. And people think the DOJ is where the power's at, but I beg to differ. I was Pam Bondi, she always said the DOJ, but actually Brad Bondi, which pretty much he pulls the strings at the SEC. That's where the money's going through. That's what you got to remember about the Epstein files, is that they don't believe in anything. They don't care about justice, not justice, prosecution, none of that means anything. Their God is money. And the SEC is really the agency that oversaw Les Wexner's companies, including Abercrombie and Fitch, which was nothing but an infestation of pedophiles. It was right there in front of you if you looked at an Abercrombie and Fitch advertisement at any time. So people are focusing on Epstein. That's the relief valve. Forget Epstein. It was Leslie Wexner you should be looking at. And the regulator there was the SEC. And who was calling all the shots? Brad Bondi. So then all of a sudden, Brad Bondi, he's getting Elon Musk off the hook, right? That's his client. He's getting all these people, Carolyn Amnesty off the hook, and Sid Chakravarti off the hook, and the Nikola founder, Trevor Milton, off the hook. He said, wow, that's an incredible stroke. This guy never won a case in his life. Now he's winning everything. Well, they know a lot about who's in the Epstein files, the unredacted Epstein files. So they've got a lot of power. But really, you got to look past those people. You got to look past Epstein to Wexner. And I think very much you got to look past Bondi. She's just there to take the punches for the people who are ultimately don't want to be exposed. But they did put one woman in prison, to their credit, I guess, Ghislaine Maxwell. None of the clientele.
Yeah, that's for sure. And so you fleshed out a bit of this network. Epstein, the Bondis. There's the links between Epstein and Bitcoin development and the stable coins with, was it World Financial and
USD1 is the stable coin.
And just to circle, well, do you think I have a thesis that one of the reasons that all this Epstein stuff is coming out now is, in one way, it'd be inevitable, but in the other, it's paving the way for technocracy, because they're going to say, look at all these corrupt human politicians. We'll have an AI algorithm run the government. Any thought on that?
Well, you're seeing it already in the war. I mean, there was 900 strikes on the first 24 hours of Iran war. That was almost all coordinated by, Anthropic and Cloud. And they're rushing it into production. And there's no human oversight. Hegseth himself got rid of the civilian committee that oversaw strikes. And what do you get? 160 dead little girls. And so we actually did probably one of our most important podcasts. I know I keep going to but one of our most important podcasts, in my opinion, is the one that we did on tech oligarchy. I wouldn't even call it technocracy. I would just call it tech oligarchy. It's called The Three Dark Ambitions of Elon Musk. And it talks about effective accelerationism, dark enlightenment, and the technological singularity, which are incidentally the precise inversions of traditional Christian theology, which deal with, in Greek we say nipsis, opsis, and enosis, which is sort of, nipsis is like the purification of the soul, opsis is like the illumination that comes from being in communion with God, and theosis or enosis is unification with God. All of that is predicated on remembrance, bringing the past into the present. So like when Christ says, do this in remembrance of me, he's not living in the future. He's actually saying, I don't know when the eschaton is. I don't know when the eschatological event is going to occur, but I know that you have to do this in remembrance of me. And by bringing the past into the present, then you'll participate in this mystical supper. Think about how different that is than what Elon Musk is trying to do in his technological way, or Netanyahu in his religious way, which is to take the future and to bring it into the present, right? They want to accelerate. You hear this word all the time. We hear Pete Hicks say, we're going to accelerate this. Or you hear the members, these wild evangelical members of the church, we're going to accelerate. Like they none of them are independent thinkers. I'll use that word, but it has a very, very distinct ideological underpinning. And you should really watch that episode if you haven't already. It's about a 1 hour episode, but I think it's very important. I think it's actually our most important episode ever, is the one on the Three Dark Ambitions of Elon Musk. And you start to realize that everything, like the purification of the soul in the church, becomes drug fueled, right? They're all on ketamine and psychedelic drugs. So they're not purifying themselves. They're actually opening their mind up, all these portals to the devil by all these substances. And then instead of the illumination, right? The opsis, the illumination of the soul, they've got the dark enlightenment. In fact, he calls it the dark maga, right? And then instead of this sort of union with God that comes from the submission of the will and participation in the holy mysteries of the church, this theosis or this enosis, they've got a technological singularity that we're going to bring from the future into the current using the Kardashev scale. If we can just get harness enough energy through nuclear power and shutting down whole cities if we have to. We'll seize all the oil in the world from Venezuela and Iran. And then we've got all the power, the Kardashev scale, and then we're just going to accelerate into the future. And we're going to, it starts to get really wacky with Yuval Harari. It is, we're just going to humans have to be eliminated in the evolutionary timeline. And you've got Elon Musk saying he's going to have a new god out of Memphis, Tennessee with his data center, these hyperscale data centers. So I don't even think these clowns understand that they've got the precise inversion of the teachings of the church. And they're perhaps the most demonic because they'll talk about a cultural Christianity where they will say simply that, I like the person of Jesus. I kind of agree with him. He's a very good teacher. That makes a lot of sense. I can't disagree. Jordan Peterson does this as well. Probably the worst attacking avant-garde. An atheist would be far better because really what they're doing is they're diminishing the Son of the living God into a good teacher. And that satisfies a lot of ignorant people who say, oh, look, he's going to be a Christian. Far from it. He wears a Baphomet suit, actually. And that's not a coincidence. It's not just merely a Halloween costume. Baphomet, as you know, was a androgynous demon. And if you look at Musk, he has all these children, none of them naturally born. He's almost certainly impotent. I think he's very angry at God. And these are all attacks on the church and on God. And you have to call them out for what they are. I mean, that's just my opinion. And I would just invite anyone to debate me on that. And the damage he's doing, when we talk about memory, look at the damage to archival memory. People who spend their days on X or using AI like ChatGPT, they really are struggling with archival memory big time. And studies coming out of MIT and everywhere else are showing that there's real damage done to the brain from excessive use.
Yeah, and what you said about this is my biggest beef recently, where people who say that they're Christian on one hand, and then in the next sentence, openly state beliefs that are completely anti-Christian. At least say who you are. I will respect you more when you're upfront with your beliefs. And Sam Altman this week, I mean, it's just to add to everything that you're saying. I can't believe it. He's like, we're going to license effectively. We're going to have a monopoly on intelligence and knowledge. And then we're going to license it back to you like a utility, like electricity or water. And I'm like,
Sam Altman, like all the rest, they're not married men. Like, they're not family men. There's something in their soul that's sick. It's not that every man has to be married or have a family. Sometimes people just can't, but we have to turn to God regardless. And the natural, the rule normally is marriage and family life. It's not a coincidence that none of these men have that. And then a sickness grows inside them. And, so yeah, absolutely. And Jordan Peterson's another one, a very loud and in my opinion, very obnoxious voice. He wears this jacket with the Byzantine icons on it, which are holy icons for the Orthodox. And he blasphemes God while he's wearing it. Can you imagine? It's like doing spiritual brain damage to the young people. I call it a spiritual lobotomy. On the one hand, you're showing holy icons on your clothing. On the other hand, you're blaspheming while wearing it. Profoundly confusing. Really, at their core, in my opinion, they're misanthropes, these people, the founders of these AI firms, including Elon Musk, who's sort of the chief one, and Peter Thiel. No question, there's a reason why they either do not understand women or they're unable to consummate a marriage. In Elon Musk's case, I suspect he probably isn't sure. He's simply unable to consummate a marriage, which is a source of great frustration for him. And rather than that leading them to humility, because we all suffer, it's a form of suffering, right? It leads them to megalomania. I'm going to show God that I am greater than him. And every despot in history had this complex. God's is going to strike me. I'm going to strike him back and show him my power. And it leads to self-destruction. And these guys, they have a perverse psychology where they don't want to rise up. They want to bring everyone down to their level in their misery, because misery loves company. So when you hear about these young men committing suicide online because they establish in their mind a romantic relationship with an AI, or you hear that 63% of men in their 30s don't have any relationship with a woman, these guys are celebrating. They're like, hey, I never had a relationship with a woman either. Look, I'm gay, or I can't even get a woman pregnant. Like they're happy because in their world, it's better everyone comes down to their level. And they're using technology for precisely the wrong things. Technology is not inherently bad. It's just abused. Even AI, it could be a very effective tool and a good tool, but in the hands of the wrong people, it's very damaging. And we see this again with the cadence of strikes in Iran. It's probably unparalleled. And look at the damage. Right off the bat, America kills 160 young girls. Shame on us. We all have blood on our hands. What an abomination. And, we talked a lot about this in the last couple of years that, the purported DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, was never about efficiency. It was about inserting AI into government. And we were one of the very early critics of that in Elon Musk. Actually, we got a lot of flack for that. People, what are you doing criticizing Elon Musk? They thought he was just the best thing since sliced bread. But now I think a lot of people are sort of on to the fact there's something very, very wrong going on here. And the sort of tentacles of these oligarchs in government, they're really the shadow power, the shadow presidents. And, you see these pictures of Elon Musk, it's a very close relationship with Netanyahu and so forth, this convergence of the greed of the tech oligarchs and the desire for power. And then for the Zionists in Israel, it's this idea that they're going to bring about the next Messiah, this king and this political leader. It seems to work really well for them. They're like peas in a pod, only it's all filled with darkness and the Antichrist. And of course, our Antichrist as Christians is their Messiah. So there's a convergence. There's a eschatological convergence for the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians, as different as our theologies are, and they could not be more different. In the end, no pun intended, they come to the same place.
You've given us a broad sweep of many topics, as is my point. What I try to do in the limited time that we have, in an hour, a little over, to just get my guests sort of broad sweep of things, digital download. What to do about these issues in many ways. You mentioned earlier, I think one thing that I keep promoting is not to be fearful. Jesus said it many times, not to be fearful. As you mentioned earlier, there's listeners who freak out. They're running all over the planet to try and, there's the quote in the Bible that says that even the kings, the mighty men, they're building their bunkers now. They can't hide. What makes you think you can hide? And then people just worrying about this, globalist or that, transhuman or technocratic technology. And I think within reason, we have to do things to protect ourselves, like, from being debanked and all that. You make normal arrangements, but not to be fearful. So any thoughts on how to prepare for the way forward?
Hervoya, that's exactly right. Christ repeatedly implores us in the gospel, the Holy Gospel, to be not afraid. The antidote to fear is faith. You cannot be afraid and faithful at the same time. Cultivate faith in your heart. Do that by going back to church. Seek repentance. It's not a nice word in our society. It's a society that has been, we've had this explosion of narcissism and selfishness driven by social media, where we love our own image of ourselves through the selfie, right? That was the beginning of it. Go to church and look at the cross. Look at the holy icons of Christ, or the Christ child, or the Virgin Mary. Get the focus off yourself. Discover other people and be in communion with them before you're living God. And then you will begin to feel that fire of faith in your heart. And you realize that these people, they seem to be very powerful, but in fact, they have no power. And that's what I recall in my fight with the government, which spanned over a decade, 1 decade. The SEC, and also the FBI, they got the FBI on me as well. Just one priest. How could one? They spent $14 million on that prosecution, unlawful prosecution. A congressman went to jail. Their case collapsed. I beat them at trial. One guy, one man, without even a bank account. Not because it's me, but because I prayed on my knees every day for God to be with me. And during that time, my service to God was to build the chapel of St. Catherine's to glorify the living God. Return to God through repentance. Go to church. Be with the faithful Christians, because they're different. People who have Christ in their heart are different. I'm not judging the people who aren't, the secular world, but when you live a life in Christ, it changes you, full stop. So you don't have to be afraid. Ultimately, God's will be done. That is the most simple prayer that Christ teaches us to pray, right? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Notice in there, our daily bread. Don't compromise yourself for more zeros in your bank account. Your daily bread is enough. That will be enough. It's easy to compromise. All these tech oligarchs did it a long time ago. These political figures, the Bondi family and so forth, they'll protect pedophiles. They'll protect Big Pharma that kills for profit. Don't have anything to do with that, and leave the rest in God's hands.
I think that's the perfect place to end. It's been a fantastic discussion. Your links are in the description, but where would you direct people?
Well, we're on all social media. My last name is Lemelson, at Lemelson, Lemelson on X, on Facebook, on YouTube. Our really didactic episodes are YouTube episodes. We don't make any money from our social media that we publish. We do have a Substack that we charge for, but most of our articles are free, maybe like 80%. But if you were inclined to join we do some securities analysis articles, are really higher level security analysis for allocating capital. There is a charge for that just covers some of our time because it's an enormous amount of time. But if you would like, we could give you a discount link for your listeners to bring the cost down. It's if they're not professional investors or something, it could be thought of as high. We could give you a discount link with like 66% off or something for your listeners if you'd like. Otherwise, everything else is free. All the religious stuff, all the theological, all the teaching. Only when we get to the high level security analysis do we have any paywalls.
All right. Well, all those links will be in the description wherever people are consuming this podcast. And thank you for coming on Geopolitics and Empire.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. I hope we can do it again sometime.